Revelation 11:3 then says, "And I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." And that clothed in sackcloth is an Old Testament reference. This is the prophets coming in judgment and in mourning. These prophets will seem very out of place, dressed in sackcloth, and they'll be prophesying. These will be like old-time prophets of the Bible here in modern times during the wrath of God and the tribulation. And so the two witnesses will be around during the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. And what we see is, in the first 3.5 years, we see those wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilences. And then at the midpoint, at the 3.5-year mark, this marks the rise of the Antichrist, the institution of the mark of the beast, without which no one can buy or sell. And there will come a time when the financial institutions of the world and all world governments will give their power and authority to the beast and to Satan and to Antichrist. And then in Revelation 11:4, speaking of the two witnesses, it says, "These are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the God of the earth." And so it's interesting that the Bible calls the two witnesses two olive trees, but also two candlesticks. But let's talk about the two witnesses for a minute here. This is where we get into the identity of the two witnesses. Now, some people believe that these are just going to be two random people, two new people that are around during this time, which exist today or in that end, in those last days, who will be selected for this task by God. Okay, that's one view. There's different theories on who the two witnesses are. Others believe that it will be Moses and Elijah. And others still that it will be Moses and Enoch. And I believe, I'll just tell you up front, I believe that it will be Moses and Elijah. And there's strong biblical evidence for this that we'll get to in this sermon today. Now, getting to who they are, one of the reasons why I believe the two witnesses are Elijah and Moses, because Revelation 11:5-6 says this of them. It says, "If any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth, and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will." So when you think about the plagues and the types of judgments that these two witnesses or prophets are calling down from heaven, it's very reminiscent of the plagues and judgments in the Old Testament by Elijah and Moses. And this isn't the only reason. There's stronger reason than even this, but it was Elijah who shut the heavens so that it rained not for 3.5 years. That's not coincidental. Even Elijah, when he shut the heavens so it didn't rain, that was for a period of 3.5 years, just like we'll see in the New Testament in that second half of the book of Tribulation is when these two witnesses will really emerge. The way I see it is when the Antichrist rises up in the second half of the tribulation, that's when the two witnesses will be sent as well. They'll be preaching. We'll be here during that second half of the tribulation for a time, but the Bible says that for the elect's sake, that time will be cut short. And so we won't go through that whole 7 years. Somewhere, people that I sometimes look to have pointed that out to be about 50 days into the Great Tribulation, and into that second half of the tribulation where the rapture will occur, something like 50 to 60 days. They tied into the different feasts and festivals and just different prophecies in the Old Testament. And we'll be raptured out in that second half because that time will be cut short for us, but the two witnesses will remain. They'll be here through that entire second half as the trumpet judgments and the vial judgments are being poured out. And so the two witnesses are going to be around during that entire last 3.5 years, whereas the time will be cut short for us and we'll be raptured out sometime, we don't know exactly, but sometime into that second half of the Great Tribulation, maybe 50, 60 days into that second 3.5 years. We'll be here for that whole first 3.5 years. But whatever that time is, we just know it'll be cut short. It says, for the elect's sake, that time will be cut short. So which prophets had power to cause these kinds of plagues and judgments? It was Elijah and Moses. And we see this in Luke 4:25 about Elijah also, where Jesus says, but I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elias, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, there's the 3.5 years, when great famine was throughout all the land. And it was Moses also who called down plagues from heaven, just as the two witnesses will do. So one shuts up the heavens so it doesn't rain, that's Elijah. Another one calls down plagues, that's Moses, just as the two witnesses will do. And it was Elijah who also called down fire from heaven against the priests of Baal and their offerings to their false god. 1 Kings 18:38, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. So prophetically, the two witnesses are very reminiscent of Moses and Elijah. Malachi 4:5 also says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So we know one of them has to be Elijah, for sure. Like it says, he is going to return before the great, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. He came the first time in the spirit of John the Baptist. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. That was the first coming. But the second time, Elijah himself will come in the flesh as one of the two witnesses, and that will fulfill Malachi 4:5 in its totality. And so the Bible directly names Elijah prior to the coming of the Lord. What some people also think is that it's not Elijah and Moses, but that it's Elijah and Enoch. And that's what some people also believe. They don't believe it's Moses, but that it's Enoch. And so we've established it's most likely Elijah, but who is that second witness? Well, some say Enoch because both Elijah and Enoch went up to heaven without dying. And so the Bible says in Genesis 5:24, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So Enoch was translated. Hebrews 11:5 says that Enoch was translated into heaven without physically dying. It says, by faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. So he was just transformed. He was just taken up to heaven without dying. And Elijah also didn't taste death, but was taken up in a chariot of fire to heaven. When Elijah was with his disciple Elisha, 2 Kings 2:11 says, and it came to pass as they still went on and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So neither men died, neither Elijah nor Enoch, and they were just taken up to heaven. So I can understand this view. I can understand why some people would be attracted to this view and believe that that's the reason why. But I don't agree with it being Enoch for reasons that I mentioned just now. But in addition to all that, the most compelling evidence that the two witnesses are actually Moses and Elijah is that it was Moses and Elijah who were revealed to Jesus and the disciples during the Mount of Transfiguration, which is a picture of Christ returning in his glorified body. Not to mention the fact that Satan disputed with God over the body of Moses when Moses died. For some reason, Satan attempted to claim Moses' body, but God did not allow it. We can read about this in the book of Exodus. Moses was buried, and Satan disputed, it says, over the body of Moses because he had a different purpose for Moses. God didn't allow it because he had a purpose, right? He wanted Moses to return as one of the two witnesses along with Elijah. So God refuted Satan and laid claim to Moses' body. But the Mount of Transfiguration is the best proof of this. Think of everything, that we've pointed out. There's a lot of evidence for it being Moses. But in Matthew 16:28, Jesus ended that chapter in Matthew 16 by saying, verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And this is, again, another, passage that the preterists take as a proof text to claim that Jesus was going to return in that generation. Because he said, look, there's some of you standing here that aren't going to die until you see me returning in my kingdom. And so on the surface, we're like, whoa, okay, that could be like preterist. What does that mean? Has it already all happened? Are the preterists right? So how are we to understand this? Well, it's very simple, because the Bible was originally written without chapters and verses. That's an addition that was made in the 1800s. We didn't have the chapter division. This was added later. And it's a good tool for us. We can quote John 3:16 and turn to Romans 10:13 and so on. It's been a help. I'm glad we have those. But it can also be a hindrance to our understanding if we're unaware of it. Because if you turn to Matthew 17, the very next chapter and verse, this is Matthew 16:28. Jesus says, some of you will be around. But if you string it all together and don't divide it and keep reading, in Matthew 17, in the very next verse, is a continuation of this teaching, and it answers the question. In Matthew 17, 1-3, and after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up into an high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. And his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias, talking with him. Elias, of course, is the New Testament Greek name for Elijah, which is the Old Testament. And so there it is, the Mount of Transfiguration. He says, some of you will see the kingdom coming before you die. And in the very next verse, they see it. The apostles, Peter, James, and John, see Jesus being transfigured and returning. And who is he with but Moses and Elijah? So Jesus wasn't saying it's that specific generation that is, isn't going to pass. He was just saying, some of you are about to see this. And it was in this vision where they actually appeared in their spiritual form. And so, they were standing there. They saw that transformation. They saw the second coming. And it's Moses and Elijah. And so I think that's the strongest proof text for it being for the two witnesses, along with the plagues, shutting up the heaven for 3.5 years. All of these things line up to show definitively, in my view, that it is Moses and Elijah.